Finally, let's discuss how the blood actually returns back to the heart. Now we know that it is going to travel within the venous system. After the post-venule capillaries reabsorb the fluid, we are now going to see it's going to travel through those venules and the medium veins, and eventually into those larger veins that are going to be that inferior and superior vena cava. But we have not talked about actually how that process actually happens. Because within the veins, remember, we have a much lower pressure than we do in the arterial system. So there are going to be ways that the body is going to adjust with maintaining that lower pressure system and with help getting it back to the heart. So the first one is indeed that pressure gradient. Remember that blood is going to flow from a higher pressure to a lower pressure. Gravity is also going to help take place, as well as this process called a skeletal muscle pump, as well as the thoracic pump. And then finally, we're going to see the cardiac suction is going to help as well. So, as we had discussed earlier, if you recall the graph that showed the systolic pressure and diastolic pressure as pressure differences from the heart and then extending down into the body. And the farther away that we got from the heart, the lower the pressure it was. So if you recall that the lowest pressure within the blood vessels it will always be the superior and inferior vena cava. Remember, because blood is going to flow from a higher pressure to a lower pressure, so we always want it to be a very low pressure within that within those vena cavas. Now gravity is going to aid in getting blood back to the heart. The head and the upper body obviously is going to flow based on gravitational pull. However, we need to work a little bit harder at getting the blood back to the heart that is in the cavities, the thoracic and the abdominal cavity, as well as the lower limbs. And then cardiac suction, as we had mentioned, is going to play a part. And this is really just the body providing this kind of vacuum in the right atrium to pull or draw the blood in from the vena cavas to then return back to that heart. Now the skeletal muscle pump and the thoracic pumps are going to be the ones that are going to aid in getting the blood back from the abdominal cavity as well as the lower limbs. The skeletal muscle pump basically involves muscles that are going to surround the veins, and when they contract, they are going to constrict the vein. So if you can imagine a very long balloon and you squeeze it in one area and then keep squeezing it up and up and up, the contents or the air inside that balloon is going to push upward. So that is basically what we are seeing with the skeletal muscle pump. So this is why exercise is a really great way to help return blood back to the heart, which is then going to help the cardiac output of the heart. This is also another reason why swelling occurs when somebody sits for a long period of time, because the venous return is not being aided to get back to the heart. So actually, individuals who are elderly and cannot get out of bed, that usually they make them do these small pushes with their feet to actually engage the calf muscles to help with that pooling, that blood pooling. Now the thoracic pump is a little different based on how it's going to get blood flow back to the heart. So if you can imagine, the abdominal cavity and the thoracic cavity are going to be separated by the diaphragm, in which we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into the respiratory system as well. However, as the thoracic cavity expands, when a person is taking a deep breath, the lungs will expand and the diaphragm actually constricts, and then it contracts and it pushes downward. As it does this, the abdominal cavity is going to become smaller. So we're talking about volume differences. What happened when we looked at volume differences in the heart of the cavities? If you recall, as a cavity increased in volume, we're going to see that the pressure decreases. And as the volume of a cavity decreases, the pressure of that cavity is going to increase. So because of these small, slight pressure changes, when a person inhales and exhales, it changes the volume cavity of the abdominal cavity and the thoracic cavity. When this happens, the abdominal cavity pressure increases. The blood then wants to flow upward to the thoracic cavity. So that is how the blood flow is going to get past the abdominal cavity into the thoracic. Now, remember, we have valves that are going to prevent that backflow of blood. So as it pushes forward and the valves close, it cannot come backwards. Now, there are going to be many different reasons why circulatory shock actually occurs. Circulatory shock is just a general insufficient cardiac output. So it's basically saying that the blood, or the heart, is not pushing or pumping out as much blood as the body requires at this point. And there are going to be many reasons. Heart attack is going to be the number one reason for this. If you remember, the inadequate pumping of the apex of the heart, if there is tissue damage done from a myocardial infarction, is going to lead to cardiogenic shock. We're not going to go through all of the instances, but the last two are two that you've probably heard before. Septic shock is due to a blood infection due to a bacteria that is going to cause vasodilation. So remember, as vasodilation occurs, we're going to decrease the amount of blood pressure. Therefore, the blood flow is not going to be as adequate. Anaphylactic shock is going to give rise to the same reason. However, it's going to be done because of the antigen-antibody complex that we are forming, if you remember the ABO blood types, and with blood transfusions. However, anaphylactic shock can occur with different allergies as well. So what happens is there is a histamine reaction that occurs because of the release, and then that increases that vasodilation as well. There is one area of the body that requires a special circulatory route, which is the brain. If you remember in 204, we know that the blood does not cross into the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. However, many nutrients and blood gases do. Now, the brain regulates its own blood flow based on that blood pressure and blood chemistry, if you recall from those sense structures within the carotid artery and the aorta. It is going to maintain oxygen levels as well as carbon dioxide levels, and the brain is obviously going to be very, very sensitive based on the different levels. Any kind of oxygen deprivation will lead to damage within minutes, and actually the person will become unconscious within several seconds of oxygen deprivation. The transischemic attack these are early signs of strokes. These are really signs that are dizziness, weakness, and then eventually the stroke is going to be the actual death of tissue, which is going to be from that cerebral ischemia. Real quick, when we talked about carbon dioxide levels and the sensitivity, we're going to see that the body can go into either hypercapnia or hypocapnia. I bring this up because of the process of hyperventilation. So if you recall, anytime that somebody goes into a state of hyperventilation, they usually are said to breathe into a paper bag. And this is because hyperventilation actually occurs because the person is releasing more carbon dioxide than is within the body. So the blood gas levels for the carbon dioxide are actually off. What happens is the body tries to maintain those blood gas levels by vasoconstricting the vessels and trying to increase the amount of carbon dioxide. So when a person is blowing into a paper bag, basically they are exhaling carbon dioxide. And what the body is trying to do is increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the body so that person then just inhales more carbon dioxide to try and modify those gas levels. So that's kind of a fun fact. So here are a couple pictures. These are from your books, just giving you a general idea of the different arteries and veins that you will be responsible for in the lab setting, which we will go through. And then finally, these are a picture of the arteries and veins that are going to be responsible for feeding the head for other ones that you are going to be responsible for as well. Okay, that's all I have for Chapter 20, and this concludes the circulatory system unit, and we will talk soon. Thanks.